Okay, so there was the obviously the marches on the weekend for seen as anti-immigration marches, but it's telling that a bunch of media have rushed out to swamp their airwaves and pages of publication with article after article after article decrying what took place. A lot of it opinion-based. There is some interesting data in there, though. From the letters page, the Sydney Morning Herald from yesterday, some interesting points where people are saying, well, look, your articles miss the point on things. Well, it's because they're generally pushing an ideological bent. But one of the things that's hidden in the statistic of, we had on average a couple 100,000 people per year arriving, hides the fact that during COVID, population decreased and there were very, very few arrivals. Okay, fair enough. Once that lifted, we got multiple years of immigration happening in 1 year. Okay, problem is that wasn't spread out over many years. That was in 1 year of arrivals. And so, okay, the capacity to support that, if you spread that over many years, is more than likely going to be there. But the infrastructure and the system can't necessarily cope with that many people arriving at once. And so it's as the commenter says here, it's an unsustainable number of additional citizens in such a short period of time. I mean, adding 16% to your population in a couple of years is going to strain your infrastructure, going to strain the systems. And so, yet people waving at things like housing shortages or anything like that. As I say, it doesn't matter who you bring in. You can't slap together enough houses and apartments to accommodate everything. And so it's not an issue with people coming in. And it's like, well, okay, people are asking, well, what skills are these skilled migrants arriving with? Are they skills that are going to improve the infrastructure, or are they more softer skills? There was an article saying that a lot of the skilled migration is people coming in on white-collar jobs into things like finance. So in the old primary, secondary, tertiary type industry, they're coming in with tertiary industry skills. So they're not a primary producer, they're not a secondary producer, which are industries that support primary producers. They're a tertiary sector, which is an industry that exists independent of primary and secondary production. So your primary production are your mines, your agriculture, forestry to an extent. Your secondary producers are industries that process raw materials. So it can be things like sawmills, steelworks, even power companies are secondary producers because they're using the mined coal, etc. Shipping, rail, all that sort of stuff, because it's about taking the raw product, interfacing with a primary producer. Your tertiary, your services sector. So finance, generally. Education is a service sector because it's not, I mean, you're educating people, but your primary and your secondary producers are going to continue even if the tertiary sector doesn't exist. So it's, when you're talking about construction, your construction is generally a secondary sector. And so if you're bringing in people who are tertiary sector qualified, yes, they're going to need accommodation and things like that. But if you don't have the employment base that are in those secondary industries, then you're not going to get the infrastructure to house everybody or provide the services. Yes, there were problems in the past when there were racist immigration policies that took place. I mean, this person's complaining basically about inflation over 50 years. It's going to happen. Okay, so it points out that, yep, we're pretty good at introducing migrants and incorporating migrants from various areas. One thing which I don't think has really been talked about, or I haven't seen covered as much here, is, and this is something other nations have gone through as well. In the US, for example, there were periods where people of Italian backgrounds or Irish backgrounds were when they migrated, were excluded from jobs and everything else. There were exclusionary policies preventing them from getting certain jobs and accommodation and things like that. Whilst white Australia policies have disappeared, there have been clusters of migration from various regions, such that there is a spike as such of migrants from certain areas appear in Australia's migration history. So after Vietnam War, there was a period where a lot of migrants, legal or otherwise, were Vietnamese or Southeast Asian. And so you had a spike there, and you have suburbs in the big cities where they clustered together because they had people with shared culture, shared language, people who didn't necessarily have great English skills. At least they were then able to form a community. And so you have suburbs even now that have very historic high populations of specific ethnic backgrounds because that's where the migrants went to. Then there were migrants from Hong Kong, some of which were Vietnamese who'd gone to Hong Kong, had been detained there and then emigrated back out. There were similar spikes in after 2000 with people coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq. And then there are smaller spikes as certain refugee populations, like the Yazidi, were brought into the nation under refugee schemes. People from South Sudan after or during their civil war and things like that. So you have clusters of populations who've arrived at various times. I mean, there was a smaller spike, and I mean, there were communities coming out of the former Yugoslavia in the late 90s. Plus, as the fall of the end of the Cold War happened, there was a period of migration coming out of Eastern Europe. Up to that point, I'd never met a Romanian. After that point, I met lots of Romanians who've migrated to Australia, some of whom were denied entry. And so they went to New Zealand instead, where they were permitted in, gained citizenship in New Zealand, and then used lateral migration to come across as New Zealand citizens, but still technically Romanian in their backgrounds. So that happens. The concern sometimes people have with these communities when they come in is they don't appear to integrate when they come in. Well, because they struggle with the language. They're coming from a place where it's a big cultural shock for them. But over time, their communities eventually integrate and are accepted as part of it. And so you had this most recently being issues with Islamic migration, where you have Islamic communities growing in size because you've got people coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, which are largely Islamic nations. And they're just the most recent group of migrants to have come into the nation. Now, give it 20 or 30 years, and it's probably going to be just another part of the Aussie population, and there'll be another group of people that people look at sideways. But it happens. It's not nice that it happens. It's not great that it happens, but it happens. And I mean, the race riots at Cronulla a number of years ago were largely targeting the behaviour of some of the Islamic community, and it wasn't great that was the case. There was also a degree of organised crime behind it as well. I mean, needs to say, I mean, another community that came out was Lebanese, which were who had, I guess, a spike of arrivals after the Lebanese Civil War decades ago. So again, you've got these clusters. You look at conflict around the world, and I dare say you're going to see a spike in arrivals from that location. The problem can be when they don't leave behind the reason they left. And in Melbourne in particular, in recent years, there's been a lot of youth crime is the term they use. And sadly, a lot of it seems to be down and along ethnic lines. And for a period there, the Sudanese community was somewhat overrepresented. And it appeared that they'd brought some of their divisions with them, and they continued to express them whilst in the Australian community. And well, the rest of the community is like, what? All we see are Africans with knives running around stabbing other people. That's not nice. Well, clearly it's not nice. And unfortunately, they were overrepresented in the in the crime statistics, and so it's, well, they were maybe not receiving the support they needed or the awareness of just what issues were taking place back in Sudan that followed them. May not have been well enough understood, and so arriving in a nation where, whilst there's support, you're still lacking certain infrastructures, lacking certain support, they turn to violence. And I mean, the Victorian Police constantly were saying it's not an African crime problem, it's a youth crime problem. It just so happens that a lot of what was being captured was between effectively gang activity that was bringing divisive behaviour from before they arrived in the country as refugees. It didn't help the rhetoric and didn't help how other people saw what was going on. And yep, other people picked up on the headline that was there the day before about some good people, and well, saying that he's imitating Donald Trump. I don't know. Again, this person is continuing to repeat that allegation about what Trump had or had not said. Clearly, they've got an axe to grind, alleging that it's something you'd see from the other side, but this side, yep, whatever. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of the letters are people supporting the opinion that the newspaper holds. What else was there? Okay, sanctions, etc. Timor, shame. This is an interesting thing. I will admit, I wasn't 100% aware of this. Obviously, during World War II, prior to World War II, Indonesia was the Dutch East Indies, so it was still a colony of the Netherlands. East Timor was still a colony of Portugal, a Portuguese colony. Papua New Guinea was technically a protectorate / colony of Australia. It had been a German colony in World War I, which Australia gained possession of kind of as a war prize coming out of World War I. But the Japanese forces did conduct land invasion through the Indonesian archipelago. And so, yep, I knew Portugal had been neutral in the war, and I'll admit I didn't know what had happened with East Timor during World War II. Know what happened afterwards, like when it went for independence. But apparently Australia invaded East Timor during World War II. I'd never heard about that in the history books. And then withdrew and basically in the vacuum the Japanese moved in. And, well, little wonder that's not really covered in Australian history books, because it's not very nice what we did. I mean, you had Z-Force and other commando aspects. You had a fair bunch of activity, obviously through the archipelago up off northern Australia. But yeah, that doesn't put Australia in a good light, to speak. There was another couple of things coming down. Okay, people complaining about infrastructure and money going into things that we shouldn't. The idea that, well, back when it was still a White Australia policy, or not far after, was that back in the mid to late 20th century, that migration into the country was at a rate commensurate with the infrastructure developments, and so new arrivals could easily move into a standard of living that the rest of the nations supported and access the same services without too much issue. Well, we're talking about pre-Medicare type things, so I guess the number of services the nation already had probably very few and far between. But yeah, it's I guess a change in how that goes. Complaints about housing affordability and what you should do with the underemployed or the unemployed. Well, I mean, I don't think a lot of people like that, like being that by choice, and certainly wouldn't mind additional training. But then you have that problem where all of a sudden a bachelor's degree is considered a minimum just to get your foot in the door for an interview. Well, go back 30 odd years and you could walk into that with a technical certificate, or a level 2, level 3 cert in practices that were more vocational type roles. But now you need degrees or postgraduate certificates and things like that. Yeah, training is good, but it's got to be well focused.